Sundar's unexpected story for a long moment. The room was silent, not the kind of silence that comes from indifference or boredom, but the kind that swells and stretches after a moment so uncomfortable that no one knows how to respond. The kind of silence that feels like it's pressing on your chest, the young reporter. Her name tag reading Mira D, intern correspondent, lowered her microphone slowly, cheeks burning red. Her question had been honest, curious, and maybe a little naive. She hadn't meant to offend anyone. She was just trying to understand, how do you handle being seen as not good enough, even when you're successful? She had asked it with wide eyes, vulnerable and sincere. But the moment the words left her lips, the audience erupted in chuckles. A few in the front row even scoffed openly. Camera zoomed in. A man in a dark blue suit leaned over and whispered to the person next to him. Dumb question. He's the CEO of Google, for God's sake. And Sundar Pichai had sat still a stone. No reaction, no frown, only a slow blink. The room waited for him to respond, expecting a quick deflection, maybe a joke to lighten the moment. But instead, Sundar leaned forward slightly. His hands rested calmly on his lap, and his eyes met the reporter's, not with annoyance, not with arrogance, but with something far deeper. Thank you for that question, he said, softly. The chuckling stopped. No one expected that. He paused, then turned his head slightly to the side, as if searching for the right thread of memory in the cluttered rooms of his past. When I was 17, he began, I failed the entrance exam for the Indian Institute of Technology. The sentence hit the room like a soft, slow thunderclap. Eyes widened. Whispers stopped. My father had saved for years just to buy me books. My mother would light the gas only once a day to save money, so she could make me tea while I studied. We didn't have a refrigerator, or a car, or a computer, but we had hope. We believed that education could change everything. He inhaled slowly, eyes lost in the past. When I opened the envelope and saw that I didn't qualify, I didn't just feel like I failed an exam. I felt like I failed my family. I locked myself in the room for 3 days. I didn't eat. I didn't speak. I just sat there thinking, maybe they were right, maybe I wasn't good enough. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. Others leaned forward. The laughter from before now felt shameful, like a stain on the air. On the 4th day, he continued, I walked outside. I still remember the light. It was bright, almost blinding. My father was sitting under the neem tree outside our building. I thought he would be angry or disappointed. But he just looked at me and said, you didn't fail. You just found a different path. Sundar's voice softened. That line changed my life. He paused again, letting the words settle. I went on to study metallurgical engineering in another university. It wasn't my first choice. It wasn't glamorous, but I gave it everything. And years later, when I applied for a scholarship to Stanford, I wrote about that failure, and they let me in. Someone gasped. You see, he said, his eyes sweeping the crowd, people like to celebrate success. They like the finished product, the title, the position, the headlines. But what they forget is that success is made of invisible things. Nights when you cry quietly and still study the next morning. Days when you feel like you're nothing, but you show up anyway. Rejections that break your spirit, but also shape your character. The reporter stared at him, frozen. Sundar smiled gently at her. You asked me how I deal with being seen as not good enough. The truth is, I don't try to change how people see me. I focus on how I see myself. A quiet murmur of awe swept through the audience, like a soft wave. Because there will always be people who don't believe in you, who laugh, who doubt. But the most dangerous voice is the one inside your own head. He leaned forward just a bit more. You must protect that voice. Train it. Feed it with kindness. Surround it with truth. The room was still, not a phone. Rang. Not a whisper passed. Sundar continued, but his voice turned inward now, more like he was talking to his younger self than to the crowd. I remember this one day during my first semester at Stanford. I had $1 in my pocket. I hadn't eaten all day. I walked into a cafe and saw a sandwich for 99 cents. I bought it. And when I unwrapped it, it smelled like hope, like progress. Like maybe, just maybe, I was becoming someone. His voice cracked, but only slightly. You know what's funny? I have access to the best chefs in the world now. But no meal has ever tasted better than that sandwich. The audience was breathless. So when someone questions whether I'm good enough, he said, I remember that boy with $1, shaking with hunger, sitting alone with a sandwich and a dream. And I remind myself, he made it. Tears welled up in the reporter's eyes. And if he can, Sundar said, turning his gaze back to her, then so can you. For a long moment, the silence returned, but this time it was different. This silence didn't feel heavy. It didn't feel awkward. It felt sacred. A woman in the back slowly rose to her feet and began to clap. One by one, others joined. It wasn't wild applause. It wasn't loud or theatrical. It was respectful. It was slow, meaningful. A man near the center of the crowd wiped his glasses. Another person dropped their head, deeply moved. The young reporter stood, frozen, her hand still on the microphone. For a moment, she looked down, overwhelmed. But then Sundar gave her a nod. A silent message. Stand tall. And she did. But just as the moment felt like it would settle into something beautiful, a voice broke through the applause. Loud, smug, dismissive. Are we done with story time? The voice said, from the front row. Gasp spread through the audience. A man in expensive tailored suit, gold watch glittering under the lights, leaned back in his seat, smirking. It was Graham Lockhart, billionaire tech investor, known more for controversy than compassion. He waved his hand like he was brushing away dust. So we're applauding poverty now? Is that what this has become? He said, laughing to himself. The man runs Google, and we're crying over a sandwich. The applause stopped. The energy shifted instantly. MEERA. The young reporter turned pale. Sundar didn't move. Graham chuckled again and tapped his phone. I didn't come here for bedtime stories. I came here to hear about AI, innovation, big tech. Not this emotional fluff. A murmur of disagreement echoed around the hall, but no one confronted him directly. The lights were still on Sundar, and he sat still, not angry, not shaken. Just. Then, after a beat, he rose slowly to his feet, picked up his microphone again, and said only 4 words that would go viral within minutes. Watch what happens next. And with that, Sundar stepped down from the stage and walked out of the room. Camera crews scrambled. Reporters whispered frantically. Some followed him. Others stayed frozen. The room was no longer just a place of applause and questions. It had become a place of waiting. Waiting for what Sundar meant. Waiting for what was coming next. Waiting. To understand. Asterisk tension builds the hallway. Outside the auditorium, echoed with hurried footsteps, camera shutters, and confused whispers. Sundar Pichai walked calmly down the corridor, flanked by no security, no assistants, no entourage. The double doors of the massive conference room slowly swung shut behind him, muffling the chatter inside. But even before the wood closed fully, it was clear the energy of the event had changed. Something had just happened, something big. The reporters didn't know whether to follow him or stay seated. Half of them remained frozen, gripping their pens and phones, while the other half rushed after him, unsure what they were even chasing. But by the time they reached the end of the hall, Sundar had vanished. A single elevator door was just closing. No one had seen him enter. No one knew which floor he was going to. MEERA, the young reporter, stood near the stage, trembling. The microphone still hung limply from her hand. She hadn't moved since Sundar left. Her face was pale, but her eyes, they weren't filled with embarrassment anymore. They were filled with something else, something between confusion and awe. The billionaire investor, Graham Lockhart, remained in his seat, legs crossed arrogantly, scrolling on his phone like nothing had happened. Well, that was dramatic, he muttered to himself, loud enough for others to hear. Must have forgotten his lines. A few people chuckled nervously, but most were still too shaken. There was something about Sundar's voice, his words, his silence, that refused to leave their minds, and then came the storm. In less than 10 minutes. Twitter was flooded. Sundar sandwich. Hashtag watch what happens next. Hashtag emotional fluff. Some praised Sundar for his humility and honesty. Others mocked him for being too soft to handle criticism. News outlets scrambled to post articles. Tech bloggers uploaded reaction videos dissecting every second of the exchange. Split screen showed Sundar's face on one side and Graham Lockett's eye roll on the other. On one podcast stream, a guest host laughed. "This isn't a therapy session, Sundar. Grow up." But then something strange began to happen. The video clip of Sundar telling his story started trending on every major platform. Not because of controversy. Not because of scandal. Because people were crying. Thousands of comments poured. And I failed my exam yesterday and thought I was worthless. Now I'm rethinking everything. This man just described my childhood. I feel seen. That sandwich story. I felt that in my soul. But Sundar didn't reply. He didn't post anything. He didn't go live. He didn't even acknowledge the noise. He was gone. For the next 24 hours, Google's CEO seemed to disappear from the public eye. No statements, no press releases. His assistants told reporters he's taking some personal time. Mira, meanwhile, had returned to her hotel room in a daze. The moment kept replaying in her mind, her question, the laughter, Sundar's voice. And then the moment he said, "Watch what happens next." She didn't know what that meant. And now she was being dragged into it. Her inbox exploded. Some called her brave. Others called her foolish. People debated whether she had planted the question. Someone on a podcast accused her of ambushing Sundar. A major news site ran a headline that read, "Rookie reporter pushes Google CEO to breaking point." Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the messages. Some were kind. Most weren't. And then, somewhere deep in her inbox was an unexpected email. From personal@sundar.com subject. A question that mattered. Body. Mira, thank you. You asked something real? If you want to understand what comes next, meet me at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Lobby of the old Heritage Metro Station. Wear comfortable shoes. Sundar. She stared at the screen. Was this real? She checked the email header. It was verified. It really was him. The next morning, she wore jeans, sneakers, and a gray sweatshirt to avoid being recognized. She arrived at the station early, her nerve pulsing in her stomach like tiny drums. At exactly 9 a.m., a black car pulled up. The window rolled down slowly. Sundar sat inside, looking calm, but different. Not like a CEO. Not like a public figure. Just. Human. He gestured for her to enter. She hesitated. Then neither spoke as the car pulled away from the station and entered the traffic of the city. The streets were loud, dusty, alive with movement. Rickshaws honked. Street vendors shouted. People ran across roads without fear. It was the rhythm of chaos, the kind that only a place like India knew how to turn into harmony. Ara finally broke. The silence. Where are we going? Sundar smiled softly. Back to where everything began. The drive took nearly 4 hours. They passed fields, factories, slums, and then finally entered a narrow lane that led to a quiet rural village. The air was different here. Slower, simpler. They stopped near a small, worn-down school building made of faded bricks and rusted tin roofs. The paint peeled off in flakes. The windows were cracked. The bell that hung above the entrance looked like it hadn't rung in years. This, Sundar said quietly, was my first school. Mira looked around in disbelief. You studied here? He nodded. I sat on floors, wrote with borrowed pencils, shared textbooks. But I learned everything. Here, not just science and math. I learned patience, gratitude, hope. They entered the school. Inside, children sat cross-legged on mats, listening to an elderly woman reciting a story. When Sundar entered, heads turned. A few teachers gasped. One older man stumbled to his feet, wiping his hands on his kurta, tears springing to his eyes. Sundar. Sundar Pichai. The man was thin, fragile, and his voice was weak, but his smile was warm. Master Pran, Sundar said with deep respect. They hugged. The old man held Sundar's face in his hands and shook his head. Look at you? We always knew. I didn't, Sundar whispered. Not until recently. Mira stood back, taking in the moment, until another figure appeared from behind a curtain near the back of the school, a janitor, tall, silent. His hair gray, skin weathered from years of sun and wind. He held a mop in one hand and a bucket in the other. He looked at Sundar. Sundar looked at him, in that gaze. Something passed between them. Something old and unspoken. Sundar walked toward him slowly. I never forgot, Sundar said quietly. The janitor smiled faintly. I did, he replied. I thought you would. How could I? Sundar's voice cracked. The janitor looked at Mira, then back at Sundar. You really came back. Because your kindness is the reason I ever left. Mira's mind was spinning. Who is he? She whispered to Master Pran. The old teacher's eyes softened. That man? When Sundar was a boy, he came here every morning with no lunch. The other children teased him. He never said anything. One day, this janitor, Bai, found him crying behind the water tank. He started giving him food every day, secretly, from his own home. Mira's throat tightened, and when Sundar applied for his first scholarship, Pran continued. Mohan Bai used his savings to buy him new shoes. He didn't even tell anyone. He just left them outside Sundar's door. Mira looked at the janitor again, a man the world had never heard of. A man who cleaned toilets, who carried buckets, who shaped the future without ever being seen. And Sundar had remembered. They sat together on the school steps, the three of them, Sundar, Mohan, and Mira. The sun was low, casting long shadows. The air smelled of dust, flowers, and history. You asked a question, Sundar finally said to Mira. A question that most would dismiss. But that question made me look back. And now, I know what I have to do. Mira looked at him, heart pounding. What are you going to do? Sundar smiled slowly. Not the smile of a CEO, not of a tech mogul, but of a boy who had found something precious. I'm going to answer it properly. Not just with words, but with action. And before Mira could ask how, Sundar reached into his pocket and handed her a sealed envelope. Deliver this to the global press conference tomorrow, he said. Open it live. Don't read it before. Just trust me. Her fingers trembled as she held it, but what's in it? His eyes gleamed with something fierce and quiet. Everything, he said. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the quiet school, the janitor Mohan looked up at the sky and whispered, maybe this world still has a chance. The silence before the storm the morning of the global press conference arrived like a wave crashing against stone sudden. Relentless and impossible to ignore. In cities around the world, news anchors wore serious faces and adjusted their microphones as they announced that Sundar Pichai had not made a single public appearance in 3 days. Reporters debated what "watch what happens next" truly meant. Analysts speculated that he might be preparing to step down. Others claimed it was a publicity stunt, a calculated move to boost PR for a new Google project. But no one really knew. The silence from Sundar had turned into an echo chamber filled with doubt, assumptions, and noise. In San Francisco, sleek black cars lined up outside a marble glass building where the annual Global Innovation Summit was set to begin. Red carpets were rolled out. Camera crews positioned themselves near entrances. Rows of silver chairs were arranged under a massive glass dome. The stage lit with soft white light and backed by a giant screen displaying the summit's slogan, Future by Design. But there was tension in the air. Graham Lockhart arrived in a custom suit, sunglasses gleaming, followed by 3 assistants. He smiled for the cameras, gave a mock salute, and whispered to a reporter, If Pichai doesn't show up, I'm taking the keynote spot. His confidence was loud, arrogant, rehearsed. And yet behind that smirk was a flicker of concern. Sundar's silence had unsettled more than just reporters. Behind the scenes, companies were pausing their announcements, unsure if Sundar's move would shift the entire focus of the event. In a small corner backstage, Mira sat alone. Her hands trembled slightly as she stared at the sealed envelope Sundar had given her 2 days ago. It was thin, light, unmarked, except for one thing handwritten across the back were the words, "Open it when they doubt the most." She hadn't slept. Not really. Her mind kept spinning. This one envelope had pulled her into something she didn't understand. She was no longer just a reporter asking questions. She was now the bearer of something larger, heavier. The event director appeared and nodded at her. "You're on in 15 minutes. What if this is a mistake?" She asked quietly. "Then it's a memorable one," he replied, walking off. She closed her eyes. And somewhere in the distance, the lights dimmed. The summit began. A soft piano melody played through the hall. A voice welcomed the guests, then introduced Graham Lockhart as the first speaker. He strutted onto the stage, waving like a politician, his voice booming with artificial excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "while we wait to see if our dear friend Sundar decides to grace us with his presence, let me entertain you with a few ideas about the future, real ideas, not bedtime stories." Some laughed, others looked uneasy. "We've spent too much time in tech coddling emotions," he continued. "This industry isn't about feelings. It's about function, about speed, about bold action. If we keep romanticizing failure, we'll forget what success even looks like." He paced the stage like a man performing for applause. But something felt off. The audience wasn't cheering. They were watching the door. Waiting. Double quotes. "And now," Graham said, glancing at his watch with mock theatricality, "since we're apparently holding the mic for someone who's not even here, let's move on." He turned to the side and gestured toward the curtains. But then Mira stood small, quiet, trembling slightly, but unshaken. She stepped forward and walked toward the center of the stage. The envelope was in her hand. Cameras zoomed in. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Graham frowned. "Excuse me, what?" "Mr. Pichai asked me to deliver a message," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "He's not here, is he?" Graham scoffed. "This is a tech summit, not a poetry reading." Mira didn't flinch. She held up the envelope. And then slowly tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Handwritten. She unfolded it, took a breath. And read, "To those who believe questions can be dumb, I offer you this. I am the product of questions. I questioned whether I was enough when I failed. I questioned why my mother stayed up at night sewing torn shirts. I questioned what worth meant when I had none in my pockets. I questioned the silence when people laughed at my accent, my skin, my background. I learned that questions shape us far more than answers." The question that young reporter asked me was not dumb. It was the most important question I've been asked in years. And it reminded me that we still live in a world where quiet voices are laughed at until they become impossible to ignore. So I am stepping away, not from Google, but from the stage. Today, the voice you should listen to is hers. Her name is Mira Deshmukh. She is 23. She grew up in a single-bedroom apartment in Pune, India. She worked nights while studying journalism. She asked a question that made the world pause, listen to her. Because maybe, just maybe, she is the future we've been waiting for. Mira's voice cracked on the last line. The room was still. Graham Lockhart stood frozen, color draining from his face. A few audience members began to rise, then more, until the entire room was standing, clapping, not the kind of clapping that followed success or spectacle, but something deeper. A quiet roar of respect. Tears welled in Mira's eyes as the applause swelled. But in the midst of it all, something else happened quietly. Behind the noise, a door at the back of the hall opened. And Sundar Pichai stepped in. No spotlight followed him. No music played. He walked in like any guest. No security. No announcement. He walked to the side of the stage. And for a brief second, his eyes met Mira's. He gave her a soft nod. Not, well done. Not, good job. Something deeper. Something more like ... double quotes, you belong here. She smiled ... and as the crowd applauded louder, Sundar turned and walked. Out again ... no press interviews. No photo ops ... just gone ... and in that moment, the world saw something rare ... power ... used not to speak louder, but to lift another voice. The next morning, newspapers all over the world carried the story, but not with headlines about Sundar's words. Instead, they read, "Who is Mira Deshmukh?" A reporter, a question, and a moment that changed everything. Tech listens to emotion for once. But even as the story spread, something was stirring behind the scenes. Online hate against Mira was also rising. Trolls accused her of scripting the question for fame. Podcasts mocked her as a woke puppet. One viral post read, "Sundar is too soft. This is why Silicon Valley is falling behind." She tried to ignore it. But it grew until 3 days later, someone published a deepfake video of her, edited. To look like she was mocking Sundar's story, it wasn't real. But it spread. And for the first time since that press conference, Mira cried not from joy, but from fear. That night, someone slipped a note under her hotel door. No name. Just a line. He made it through. S.O. Kenya. She didn't know who sent it, but she knew what it meant. She picked up her phone, took a breath, and wrote one sentence on social media. "I'm not backing down." The post was shared 12 million times in less than 48 hours. And from across the globe, Sundar Pichai saw it and smiled, because the storm had passed and the world was finally listening. Truth uncovered 3 days passed like a lifetime. The storm around Mira Deshmukh grew louder. She tried to stay strong, but strength wasn't always a straight line. Some moments, she stared at the wall in silence, feeling the weight of it all pressing down. Other times, she clutched her phone tightly, watching cruel messages roll in. Like waves that wouldn't stop. Some messages questioned her story. Others attacked her character. A few even wished she would disappear. Every time she refreshed her feed, she felt like she was breathing in smoke thick, choking, poisonous. She had tried to speak up, tried to be brave. But now, she wondered if the cost was worth it. Yet, through the chaos, one message stood out. It had no profile picture. No name. Just 4 words. He made it through. Those words became her anchor. She printed them out and taped them to her mirror. Each time she passed by, she read them again. He made it through. It wasn't a slogan. It wasn't encouragement. It was a reminder. Sundar Pichai had endured worse. Shame, ridicule, failure, loneliness. And still, he rose. And now something inside Mira whispered that she needed to understand why. Not just what Sundar said on stage or what he wrote in the letter, but what truly shaped him. What truth lay hidden behind that humble calmness? What loss? What pain? What fire? So she began to dig, not as a reporter, but as a seeker. And what she found left her breathless. In a dusty government archive in Chennai. After hours of searching, she uncovered a small scholarship fund listed under the name Mohan Desaram Trust, named after the janitor Sundar had introduced her to. There were only a few scattered records, but what caught her eye was a fragile yellow document from 1992, stating a transfer of 2,000 rupees from Mohan Desaram to Vishwanathan Pichai, Sundar's father. It had a short note attached, handwritten in Tamil. She had it translated. It read, "For your boy's dreams," quietly, without return. She stared at the note for a long time. Mohan hadn't just helped Sundar out of kindness. He'd funded the first step of his journey, without recognition. Without applause. A janitor in a rusted school had planted a seed that would one day change. The world. Tears filled her eyes. For so long, she thought success came from boardrooms and investors. But this ... this was different. This was raw, real, hidden beneath the surface like the roots of a great tree. She booked a flight the next morning and returned to the village where Sundar had taken her before. The school was still the same, quiet. Modest, surrounded by wildflowers and red earth, but Mohan Desaram was not there. She asked around. A teacher gently informed her that Mohan had fallen ill after Sundar's visit. He had been moved to a small hospital nearby. Me rushed there. Immediately, the hospital was nothing more than a pale blue building with creaking fans and beds separated by thin curtains. She found him lying on a cot, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow, but when she stepped closer, he opened his eyes and smiled. You came. He whispered me and knelt beside him. You gave him everything, she said softly. And you never asked for anything in return. Mohan blinked slowly. His voice was weak but clear. I didn't give him everything, he replied. Just enough. Why? She asked. He looked at the ceiling, eyes distant, because I saw myself in him. The hunger, the silence, the shame of being too smart in a world that doesn't expect it from you. He never forgot you, she whispered. Mohan smiled again. That's enough for me. Mira sat with him for a long time. She didn't speak, didn't ask more questions. Some truths didn't need words. They just needed to be felt. When she finally stood to leave, Mohan grabbed her hand. You keep asking the right questions, he said, even when the world laughs. She nodded, eyes wet, and as she walked out of the hospital, she knew what she had to do next. Back in Delhi, a press invitation appeared on the global newswire. Google CEO Sundar Pichai to make a rare public appearance. Topic: rethinking success. Location: Dharavi Community Center. Mumbai location stunned everyone. Dharavi was one of the largest slums in the world. Why would the world's most powerful tech leader choose that place? Media rushed in. Cameras were packed. The world waited. MEERA received a personal message. A voice note from Sundar. His voice was soft. This isn't about redemption, he said. It's about revolution. She flew to Mumbai the next morning. The community center was buzzing. Children in hand-me-down uniforms ran across the dusty field. Volunteers arranged chairs on a simple open-air platform made of bamboo and cloth. There was no luxury, no spotlight, no screen. Just people. And purpose. As the sun began to rise behind the hazy skyline, Sundar stepped onto the stage, not in a suit, not behind a podium, but in a simple shirt and sandals, holding nothing but a folder in his hands. He looked out at the crowd, local school children, teachers, janitors, reporters, and yes, a few billionaires in crisp suits looking deeply out of place. And then he spoke. We've measured success with the wrong tools. He began. His voice carried no arrogance, only conviction. Titles, stock prices, applause. These are easy, but the real markers of success are invisible. He held up the folder. Today, I am announcing the Roots Initiative. A murmur swept through the crowd. It will identify unsung heroes, janitors, single mothers, bus drivers, school cooks, factory workers, people who made success possible for others without ever being seen. We will fully fund education for their families, build homes, create scholarships in their names. He looked at the audience and then directly into the cameras, because no child should rise alone, and no hand that lifts another should be forgotten. Silence fell. Then came the applause, steady, strong, heartfelt. A woman in the front row sobbed openly. A young boy whispered, Mommy, I want to be like him. Sundar continued. Mohan Desaram didn't build an app. He didn't start a company, but he changed the world. Through me. The crowd stilled, and Neera Deshmukh didn't ask a dumb question. She asked the only question that mattered. He turned and gestured for her to join him. MEERA stepped onto the stage slowly. Unsure. The crowd applauded again, even louder this time. Sundar turned to her and said, You asked how I deal with not being seen as enough. He paused, smiled. The answer is, remember where I came from. Then he handed her the mic. MEER looked out at the sea of faces, real people. Not social media profiles, not critics, not trolls. Just human beings. She swallowed her fear, and spoke. I thought being a reporter meant asking questions, she said softly. But now I know it also means standing for something. The wind picked up, carrying her voice gently. I was told I was too young, too emotional, too soft. But the truth is, and empathy isn't weakness. It's power. The crowd erupted, but one person in the back sat frozen. Graham Lockhart. He had come out of curiosity, expecting another moment of emotional theater. But now, as he watched the crowd cheer and cry and rise to their feet, something shifted in him. A memory flickered, a long-forgotten one, of his own mother cleaning motel rooms to afford his textbooks, of nights when she rubbed her hands raw with bleach, only to wake up at dawn and make breakfast. He had buried those memories deep beneath money and pride and ambition. But now they surfaced. He stood quietly. And left. Not in arrogance, but in silence. That evening, Mira walked down the quiet street beside the center, the crowd having long since dispersed. The sky was orange and the city buzzed softly. Sundar walked beside her. You changed things today, he said. She looked up at him. So did you? No, he replied. I just remembered who I was. You reminded me. They stopped at a corner shop, bought chai from a vendor who had no idea who Sundar was, sat on a wooden bench and sipped silently. What happens next? She asked. He smiled. We stop chasing applause, he said, and we start amplifying truth. As the sun dipped behind, the skyline and the city lights flickered to life. Mira knew the world had turned a little bit quieter. And in that quiet, something powerful was growing. Something honest. Thing unstoppable. Asterisk. The world listens weeks past. Not in silence. Not in noise. But in a strange, collective hum. The kind of vibration that spreads when the world senses that something has changed. Even if it can't quite put words to it. In villages and cities and tech labs and tea stalls, people started talking not just about Sundar Pichai's speech or Mira's question, but about the idea. The simple, radical idea that success doesn't begin at the top. It grows quietly in the shadows, in homes that smell of sweat and sacrifice, in hands that hold others up without asking for anything. In return, the Roots initiative exploded beyond anyone's expectations. What began as a quiet tribute to one janitor in a village school became a tidal wave. Google partnered with small community organizations around the world to identify overlooked heroes. Names no one had ever typed into search bars. Faces that had never appeared on magazine covers. But stories that carried more weight than most CEOs could bear. One of the first scholarship recipients was a girl named Amina from Lagos. Her father, a street sweeper, had once walked her 5 miles to school every morning. Today, she stood at a podium in front of world leaders, announcing her admission to MIT. Another was a young man named Lucas from Brazil. His grandmother had sold fruit on sidewalks to pay for his books. The Roots Fund paid for her medical treatment and set up a clinic in her neighborhood named after her. The world was watching. And for the first time in a long time, it was listening to the quiet, but the most unexpected moment came when Graham Lockhart, the billionaire who had once laughed at Sundar's sandwich story, called a press conference. It wasn't held at a luxury hotel or a Silicon Valley boardroom. It was held in front of the motel where he grew up. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered. But Graham looked different. Not in appearance. In presence, he stood behind a simple wooden podium. No teleprompter, no entourage. And then he began to speak. My mother cleaned bathrooms here, he said. When I was 6, I hid behind the laundry carts because I was ashamed of what she did. I used to tell people she worked in hospitality. He paused, voice shaking. I climbed out of this place and tried to forget where I came from. I built walls, big ones. I mocked weakness because I thought it kept me strong. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared someone would see through the suit. He looked into the crowd. Sundar Pichai didn't expose me. He reminded me. He stepped away from the mic. And with a quiet, steady hand, removed the gold watch. he always wore. He walked over to a young boy sitting near the steps, wearing a janitor's uniform. He handed the watch to him, and whispered, "This means nothing if you forget who you are." The clip went viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real, and suddenly everyone was asking themselves, who helped me rise? Who carried me when no one was looking? For Sundar Pichai, life didn't go back to normal, because he didn't want it to. He declined speaking at 3 major tech summits, refused magazine interviews. When asked why, he simply replied, "I'm not needed there right now." Instead, he began showing up in places that didn't make headlines. A shelter in Detroit, a village school in Bangladesh, a small town in Arkansas, where a school bus driver named Gloria had raised 8 children, none her own, and sent them all to college with lunch tips. Sundar sat in her kitchen, sipping sweet tea and listening to her stories, and he made sure her name was remembered, Vera. Meanwhile, had become a voice for the voiceless. Not because she wanted fame, but because she had finally realized that journalism wasn't about attention, it was about illumination. She started a series called Quiet Giants, profiling ordinary people who had done extraordinary things. With no spotlight, no reward. Her first story, Mohandas Aram. She returned to the hospital where he was still recovering. This time, she brought cameras. Not to exploit him, but to honor him. They filmed him slowly walking through the school again, him brushing against old walls, children running up to him with bright eyes. When the video aired, donations poured in, not for Sundar, not for Google, but for the school, the children, the village. And Mohan's name was etched on a new library, being built beside the school, but something even more powerful happened. All over the world, people started writing letters, not to politicians, not to celebrities, but to their own Mohans. Father, a neighbor, a teacher, a stranger who once paid for a meal, letters poured in. You gave me hope when I had none. I never said thank you, but you saved me. I thought no one noticed, but I noticed you. Some were delivered in person, others were left at gravesites. A few were sent anonymously, because sometimes gratitude doesn't need a return address. And as the letters grew in number, so did the realization we all stand on someone else's shoulders, and most of the time, those shoulders belong to people the world never sees. One afternoon, Mira sat in the Google courtyard, sipping chai with Sundar. The sun was setting. They talked about nothing and everything. At one point, she asked him something quietly. Do you ever feel like it's too much? The pressure, the weight. Sundar looked out at the horizon. Sometimes, he said. But then I remember the sandwich. She smiled. The one that tasted like hope. He nodded. Double quotes, yeah. Because it reminded me that even the smallest acts matter. Even one sandwich, one word, one question. She looked down, a little embarrassed. I really thought it was a dumb question. She said. He shook his head gently. It was the question the world needed. They sat in silence for a while, until Sundar stood up, dusted his hands, and said something Mira would never forget. Lead with kindness, even when no one's watching. 3 years later, a young boy named Arjun stood nervously on the stage of his school auditorium in a small town in Kenya. He was holding a piece of paper, his hands shaking. His mother, who worked 2 cleaning jobs, sat in the front row, eyes shining. The boy cleared his throat. This is from my mom, he sighed. She's my hero. And then he began to read, not a speech, a letter that Mira had once written to Sundar, a letter that was now part of school curriculums around the world, a letter that ended with the words, never laugh at a question. That comes from someone brave enough to ask, because sometimes that question is the key to a better world. The auditorium erupted in applause, and in that moment, quiet and powerful, the world listened again, not to a CEO, not to a reporter, but to a boy with trembling hands and a voice full of truth. Asterisk.